Hello, class. Welcome to our module on social thinking and social influence. Young people, especially in the US, look forward to becoming adults and being independent. But how independent are any of us really? Do you, for example, make your own clothing? Will you build your own home? How much of your food do you grow or hunt? Do you perform your own medical care? Will you build your own car and pave your own roads? Of all the acts that you need for survival, do you do any of them by yourself other than breathe? Even for that, you count on the government to prevent excessive air pollution. Humans are extremely interdependent. Our survival depends on cooperation. In spite of this, as we think about human behavior, we often tend to focus on the individual and the individual's unique experiences that shape who they are. When we do this, though, we are missing a very important part of the picture. This part is the effect of the social environment. In this module, we'll be exploring the effects of the social environment on individual behavior. We'll also explore how we form impressions of others. We'll explore concepts including prejudice, discrimination, the social aspects of persuasion, conformity, many of the strategies used to influence human behavior, and we'll also be looking at obedience. These are just a few of the interesting concepts that you'll be learning about in this module. Before we get started, let's do a little bit of myth or reality. Let's see what you think. So what do you think? Appearance, how a person looks, is an important source of information that people use when forming impressions of others. Do you think that this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? Here's another one. Most of the quick or off-the-cuff judgments that we make about the people we encounter are not very accurate. Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you said definitely true, you're correct. In less than a second, the time it literally takes to say hello, or less than that, we make a snap judgment about a person's personality. Maybe we hear only a brief utterance, and then we decide whether we're going to approach the person or we're going to avoid them. And these rapid appraisals have a long history in human history. Think about how adaptive it is for us to be making quick assessments or quick judgments. This would have helped our ancestors to make quick choices in the face of potential danger. We were able to, as humans, long ago, to make decisions that would allow us to decide pretty quickly if the person that we were meeting was a friend or was a foe, was someone that we could rely on or that we could spend time with, or someone who could be a potential danger. So it seems to be pretty adaptive to make quick judgments. And our judgments may be effective some of the time, especially with some real basic traits and characteristics. But there are so many variables that come into play when we think about who a person is and what types of qualities a person has. And it's much more than just, are they a friend or are they potentially dangerous? And yet we still rely on these snap judgments often as we make decisions about whether we want to be a person's friend or spend time with this particular person or not. And any information about a person, from their physical properties to their nonverbal and verbal behaviors, and even the environment that the person inhabits, they each influence our impressions and the judgments about our first impressions. And these first impressions have been shown to last for months and to affect personal judgments, even in the presence of contradictory evidence about the individual. So while snap judgments may have been helpful to our ancestors, and they may be somewhat helpful to us, there are some negative consequences to these snap judgments, especially when they may very well not be accurate, and oftentimes they're not. And if we think about why Let's think about a couple of the main reasons why. So quick judgments are based on factors that don't support accuracy. First, they're based on efficiency. We don't want to exert more cognitive effort or time than's necessary. So much of the social information that we process is processed very quickly and without effort. And then secondly, our judgments are selective. In other words, we see what we want to see. Think about the last time that you met someone. How different was your impression of that person than, say, another friend's impression of that person? How much of your impression was more reflective of what you might want to see or expect to see than who that person really is? Here's another one. Blatant prejudice towards certain groups of people has declined, which means that attitudes towards minority groups are now primarily positive. What do you think? Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly true, you're correct. Now, I want to state that I think it's very important for you to carefully read the statement here. It says blatant prejudice. This has declined, but the problem that we have today is that discrimination still exists. And it's less about treating people badly who are from other groups, less so than it used to be. And today, it seems to be more about giving preferential treatment to people who are part of our in-groups. In addition, today we have what we could think of as implicit or subtle biases. So subtle biases are unexamined and sometimes unconscious, but they have real consequences. They're automatic. They may be ambiguous or ambivalent, but they are biased and they are unfair and they're disrespectful to the belief in equality. So we tend to often have a preference towards our own in-group. We'll be looking at in-groups and out-groups. And this in-group preference we could think of as being favoritism. And there are different ways that we can measure this. There's one that's called the implicit associations test. And this is a test, and I'll put a link on our course website within this module so that you can try this out and see where you stand on or where you come out on implicit biases. But basically, the premise behind this is that if someone is given a task that requires quick processing, so you're asked to quickly process information, you're not able to think much about your choice, and that this will then uncover your implicit biases. So this is a very interesting test, and I think it's very reflective of many of the very significant and important issues that we're facing as a society today. So when we say things like, I am not prejudiced, without examining the preconceived notions that we may have, or without examining our beliefs about certain groups, maybe the stereotypes that we hold, whether they be positive or negative, then we're really not fully understanding where we stand and who we really are. So we have to examine that in order for us to make the needed changes so that we're not treating any group less favorably than those that you consider to be within your in-group. So we'll be looking at in-group and out-group, and we'll also be taking a look at prejudice and the factors that contribute to the development of prejudice, and we'll be looking at discrimination in this module. And then here's another one. What do you think? People bow to social pressure because they have weak personalities and are easily influenced by others. So do you think it's the people who are weak in their personality traits that are more likely to give in to social pressure? Or do you think that's not the case? Do you think that anyone is perhaps vulnerable to social pressures like conformity or obedience? If you chose definitely false, you're right. We're going to be looking at the power of the social environment. We'll be looking at concepts that involve compliance, conformity, and obedience. Overall, when we think about social pressure can cause us to change our picture of reality. And think about times when you've resisted social pressure and how that's made you feel. It often may make us feel upset, even if we know what we're doing is right. And this is because fitting in tends to feel good, even if it's at the expense of our good senses. In this video, you're going to be learning about how we form impressions of others. You're going to learn about the 5 sources of information that we use to form impressions of other people. You're also going to learn about the key differences between snap judgments and systematic judgments, and the role of each in forming impressions. You're also going to be learning about attributions and 2 attribution-based expectations that can distort our perceptions. You're also going to be learning about 4 important cognitive distortions and how they operate. And then finally, you're going to be learning about some of the ways in which perceptions that we have of others are efficient, selective, and consistent. One source of information that we use to form impressions of others is physical appearance. So I'd like for you to take a moment to reflect on this. Our perceptions of other people are influenced by their physical appearance, including the clothes that they wear. So can you think of some examples of how your perceptions are affected by the way that people dress? How do you think your own attire affects others' perceptions of you? Actions are another source of information that we use. So, for example, when you learn that one of your friends volunteers at the local animal shelter, you're likely to infer that your friend is a caring person. As we'll be looking at in the next chapter, nonverbal messages are another important source of information, and these provide cues about people's emotional states and traits. So in our culture, for example, we might assume that when someone makes steady eye contact that they're confident. And this may not be accurate. Sometimes when people make steady eye contact, there may be other reasons, or it may be that people who look away are honest, and it may just be that there's some other reason that they're looking in a different direction. We'll be looking at that more in Chapter 8. Because we do tend to know that verbal information can be easily manipulated, we do like to look for nonverbal messages to make sure that the nonverbal and verbal messages align. We also look at situational cues to help us to understand or interpret another person's behavior. So when we see someone crying, we're going to think about what is the current situation. Are they at a wedding or are they at a funeral? And so the context provides us with important information. At a recent study conducted at Harvard University that was published a couple of years ago, participants imagined coaching an employee for a particular job. When told to help the employee get better at reading others' emotions, most people recommended thinking in an intuitive and instinctive way, as opposed to in an analytic and systematic way. When told to make employees worse at the task, the participants recommended the opposite. And yet, later experiments suggested this coaching was off base. For instance, in another experiment, professionals in an executive education program took a cognitive reflection test to measure how much they relied on intuitive versus systematic thinking. The most reflective thinkers were most accurate at interpreting their partner's moods during mock interviews. Systematic thinkers also outperformed intuitors at guessing the emotions expressed in photographs of eyes. To test for causality, the researchers asked another group of professionals to recall a time when following their instincts paid off, or a time when careful reasoning did, to induce one mode of thought or the other. As predicted, when judging a partner's mood in a mock interview that followed this exercise, individuals primed to reason carefully were more accurate. Then why do we prize snap judgments of others? All of us seem to think that we are good at reading people on some level. So we think it's a lot easier than it actually is. But to judge a person's emotions accurately, we need to take into account context, subtle expressions, personal history, and our own biases. Because so much processing is needed, it's very important that we're cautious about our snap judgments, about these automatic mental processes that we engage in. And instead, we need to be very wary of our gut instincts and think more critically and effortfully about what another person is going through before we jump to conclusions. In other words, the research suggests that for us to make better judgments and form more accurate impressions of others, we need to use what are called systematic judgments. This requires more controlled processing, and it tends to occur when forming impressions of others that can affect our happiness or welfare. But we need to use these types of judgments more often than just in those instances, because relying on automatic judgments can lead us down the wrong path. Do you ever think about the influence you have on other people? What about the roles of heredity, childhood experiences, and social forces? Do you wonder why some people succeed while others fail? Individuals differ in the extent to which they feel a need to explain the events of human behavior. Although there are vast differences among us, people in general tend to ask why when confronting events that are important, harmful, immoral, or otherwise negative or unexpected, and when understanding these events has personal relevance. To make sense of our social world, we try to understand the causes of other people's behavior. But what kinds of explanations do we make, and how do we go about making them? There's a classic book that's called The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, and it was written by Fritz Heider in 1958. And he took the first step in trying to answer these questions. So to Heider, we're all scientists of a sort. We're motivated to understand others well enough to manage our social lives. We observe, analyze, and explain their behavior. The explanations we come up with are all called attributions, and the theory that describes the process is called Attribution Theory. Ask people to explain why their fellow human beings behave as they do, why they succeed or fail, laugh or cry, work or play, or help or hurt others, and you'll see that they come up with complex explanations focused on whether the behavior they observe is intentional or unintentional, and whether it reflects on the person's desire, beliefs, and personality. So, interested in how people answer these kinds of questions, Heider, the person who came up with attribution theory, found it very useful to group these causal attributions that people give into two categories. He called these personal and situational. And your textbook uses the phrases internal and external. So an internal attribution is when people attribute the causes of others' behavior to personal dispositions, to traits, abilities, or feelings. And external attributions are when people attribute the cause of others' behavior to situational demands or environmental constraints. So let's use an example that some of you may have heard of. There is a South African former professional sprinter whose name is Oscar Pistorius, and he was a Paralympic champion. And in 2013, he shot and killed his girlfriend, and her name was Reba Steenkamp. Some of you may have heard about this story. He claimed that he had mistaken his girlfriend for an intruder who was hiding in the bathroom, and then he was arrested and charged with murder. He is now serving a prison time. I'm pretty sure he is. That he's serving a. If I'm not mistaken, I think his term is 13 years or thereabouts. So in this Oscar Pistorius shooting incident, everyone wanted to know what caused him to pick up his gun in the middle of the night and kill his girlfriend. And what he had said was that he thought she was an intruder and she was in the bathroom and he had shot bullets through the door. And so people wanted to know, why did he do this? And the prosecution pointed the finger of blame at Oscar Pistorius. And they said that he was an intensely driven young man who had been overheard yelling at his girlfriend. And so this is an internal attribution, or like, Heider would have said, a personal attribution. And yet others thought that his actions were provoked by what he thought to be the sound of an intruder inside his house, and that a state of confusion ensued. And so this is an external attribution, or what Heider would have called a situational attribution. When are we most likely to use attributions? We're most likely to make attributions about the behavior of others when others behave in unexpected or negative ways, and when events are personally relevant. We're also most likely to make attributions when we're suspicious about the motives of other people. It's quite a striking feature of human nature, and it's often true that once people make their minds up about something, even if they don't have all the necessary information, they become more and more unlikely to change their minds when confronted with new evidence. People can be quite intellectually stubborn, as many of you know. You all know that political leaders often refuse to withdraw support for government programs that don't work, and scientists often steadfastly defend their theories in the face of contradictory research data. These instances are easy to explain. Politicians and scientists have personal stakes in their opinions, as votes, funding, and reputation might be at risk. But what about people who more innocently fail to revise their opinions, often to their own detriment? What about, for example, a baseball manager who clings to old strategies that don't work, or the trial lawyer who consistently selects juries according to false stereotypes? Why are they often slow to face the facts? Well, people are subject to various confirmation biases. And this is the tendency for us to interpret, seek, and create information that verifies existing beliefs. So let's now think about this concept of confirmation bias that some of you may already be familiar with, and now take it a step further and think about it in terms of the impressions that we have of other people. So confirmation bias is one of the most commonly occurring judgment biases. It really is a trick that our minds play to highlight small pieces of information that confirm what we already believe. So once you become aware of it, you will start to notice yourself doing it all the time. In order to overcome confirmation bias, especially with friends or people that you might be working with, you need to regularly ask yourself each step of the way if you are being as objective and unbiased as possible. It helps to mentally consider the opposite of your belief in search of the truth, or to try to prove yourself wrong. You can only discover the truth when you've considered all the facts, including those that do not support your original belief about your friend or the person that you work with. So think about a person that you work with, someone who you have come to believe is a difficult person. If you believe that they're a difficult person, think about how you're going to interact with them. Are you going to then get out from that person what you believe about them? So being more objective is going to help you to get different information from that person. And so you're going to see that perhaps your original belief wasn't right. It may have been right, but you're giving yourself the opportunity to get a truer experience of what that person is really like. Another important concept that relates to the perceptions that we have of others is what is known as self-fulfilling prophecies. Back in the late 1940s, a sociologist told a story about Cartwright Millingfield. He was the president of the last national bank during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The bank was solvent, yet a rumor began to spread that it was floundering. Within hours, hundreds of depositors were lined up to withdraw their savings before no money was left to withdraw. The rumor was false, but the bank eventually failed. Using stories like this, Merton, the sociologist, proposed what seemed like an outrageous hypothesis, that a perceiver's expectation can actually lead to its own fulfillment. In other words, a self-fulfilling prophecy. In 1968, psychologists Rosenthal and Jacobson published results of a study in a book that was called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Noticing that teachers had higher expectations for better students, they wondered if teacher expectations influenced student performance rather than the other way around. So to address this question, they told teachers in a San Francisco elementary school that certain students were on the verge of an intellectual growth spurt. The results of an IQ test were cited, but in fact, these students were just randomly selected.
8 months later, when real tests were administered, the late bloomers exhibited an increase in their IQ scores compared with children assigned to a control group. And they were also evaluated more favorably by their classroom teachers. So the expectations of the teacher had a significant impact on student performance, and the teachers had no idea that they were participating in this study. So what we're seeing is the belief that the teacher has influencing the way that the student behaves. So in your textbook, you see this figure, which shows how a perceiver's beliefs and actions affect the way that the other individual behaves. So you see the perceiver's impression of the other person, she's really funny, leads to the perceiver's behavior based on that impression. Tell us a story about the time when, and then there's some laughter, and then this produces corresponding behavior elicited from the other person. The other person then tells a story as requested and tries to make witty comments. So now we have this confirmation that's supporting our beliefs, and we continue to engage with this person in this way, and then this becomes the way that we see that individual.
Let's take a moment to reflect. Do you tend to think of attractive people as more competent and better adjusted than those who are less attractive? Why do you think that this is the case if you do? So if we look at research that's been going on over the past 4 decades, researchers have found that we tend to assume that attractive adults are more competent, better adjusted, more powerful, mentally healthy, intelligent, and more socially skilled than less attractive ones. Researchers have also found that people are more willing to help attractive people and to even give them more room on sidewalks. Attractive defendants are less likely to be convicted, and then when they are, they get more lenient sentences. Now, I'm sure as you think about this, you can think about the different biological, cultural, and learned factors that may contribute to this stereotype. Regardless, the next time that you meet someone who's physically attractive, remind yourself of this stereotype that the research suggests that we're all vulnerable to having. And keep in mind that research has actually shown that people who are more physically attractive don't have these traits more often than people who are less attractive. So it's not as though there's truth in these stereotypes. These are just beliefs that tend to be held about people who are seen as more physically attractive. I think it's also important to note that when you do get into a position where maybe you're going to hire someone or select someone as a group member for a project, or maybe you're considering someone to, hang out with, to be a potential friend or partner, remind yourself of this stereotype that we are each prone to having.
It's a well-known principle in psychology that people define themselves in terms of social groupings and are often very quick to perhaps think less positively about others who don't fit into those groups. Others who share our particular qualities are our in-group, and those who don't are in our out-group. Sometimes groupings are determined by factors intrinsic to who we are. It might be things like sex, age, race, or ethnicity. But in other cases, they are arrived at in a somewhat arbitrary fashion. So think about being a Red Sox fan or being a UT fan. The accident of your birth determines whether you wear a UT sweatshirt or whether you wear a Red Sox hat. So, Red Sox fans, for example, may think that there's something very bad about Yankees fans, and UT fans may think very negatively about Florida fans. So are these Red Sox fans or UT fans so fundamentally different from Yankees fans or Florida fans? Well, no. Fans of different teams are likely identical in their passion and their drive and their devotion. And more importantly, there's really no different at all in their basic human qualities. This arbitrary nature of in-group and out-group distinctions between sports fans carries over into many other everyday situations. So think about yourself as you're driving across campus. I know I live near ETSU, and when I'm driving across campus, there's a definite distinction between pedestrians and motorists. When you're a pedestrian entering a crosswalk, I know when I've walked across ETSU campus, you feel like, you can take your time and to make it across the street. But if you're the driver, you might be frustrated at the pedestrian. So, in each of those situations, you are at one point in an in-group, and from the perspective of the other person, you're in an out-group. Now, let's think about this on a more serious level. There was a very significant experiment on in-group, out-group bias that was carried out in the schoolroom of an Iowa teacher whose name was Jane Elliott. And this was in 1968, the day after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And Jane Elliott decided to address the problems of racial prejudice by dividing her third grade class into groups on the basis of eye color. And if you're interested, you can watch this experiment and learn more about it in a documentary called A Class Divided. It's a PBS Frontline documentary. So Elliot showed how easy it is to turn a 7-year-old pupil into really almost rather hateful people by making the brown-eyed children the targets of discrimination by what she had decided or sort of made up in this experiment as the blue-eyed children who. Now, keep this in mind that this was in 1968, and this would not be something you'd see being done today. We know that there are ethical guidelines in place that would not allow this sort of situation to happen, but it really provides really interesting and important insight into the power of this in-group, out-group phenomenon. So in this situation, within minutes of the brown-eyed children having been the targets of discrimination and the better, quote unquote, better blue-eyed children being the ones who were sort of the favored, what she found was that the blue-eyed children were sadistically ridiculing their classmates. They were calling them stupid and shunning them in the playground during recess. And then what she did is she flipped the situation and she showed that the brown-eyed children went on top, exacted the same punishments on their blue-eyed classmates. So although your book doesn't go into this, I do think it's important for us to think about how we can overcome this in-group, out-group trap, especially because in this class we're thinking about the psychology of adjustment. How is it that we can take what we're learning and apply it to ourselves? So we all have this tendency, and one thing that we can do is we can start by recognizing the arbitrary nature of many of our in-group and out-group distinctions. So a moment ago, I gave the example of pedestrians and motorists. And, that was a very, basic example, probably one that's non-threatening, but think about some that might be more significant and how those are also very arbitrary. Another thing you could do, I think, is, put yourself in the place of the out-group member. Just like in Jane Elliott's classroom that I mentioned a moment ago, they were sad and afraid when they were suddenly put into the role of the out-group member. So think about times when you were in an out-group and remember how painful that is. And I think also it's important for us to think about commonalities between the in-group and the out-group. So when we find that common ground, like opposing sports teams who have an equal love of the sport, or if we think about political ideology, thinking about the similarities between those two groups, how can we find that common ground? And so that these basic human traits and values, they really can transcend particular labels. And I think it's too important for us to help others to overcome these in-group and out-group biases. We want to pass along these things that we're thinking about. Of course, we want to do this in a very thoughtful way, in a way that's non-threatening and non-judgmental. But the more that we can help others to recognize the value in overcoming out-group stereotyping, then the better off our communities and society can be. When we think about in-group and out-group biases, what we're talking about is how we categorize people. And the research suggests that we do tend to have more negative attitudes towards people who are in our out group. So in other words, people who are not part of our in-group. We also tend to see out-group members as more alike than they really are. This is called the out-group homogeneity effect. And you also in your textbook can read about how this affects eyewitness recall as someone is being asked to remember something that they saw. People have a tendency to have a greater difficulty differentiating facial characteristics among people who are part of their racial outgroup. The visibility of outgroup members is also heightened when they comprise the minority in the crowd. Later in the textbook, we'll talk about the pressure that this can lead to on people who are in the workplace, who may be in a minority position. It may be that they are the only female, they're the only male, the only African American, and so forth. And this can put a lot of pressure on that person to feel as though they need to perform in order to represent that group of people that they are part of and that they've come to, in the eyes of others, represent. And then people are even likely to see out-group members as looking more like each other than they actually do, which relates back to number 2. So when we think about in-group and out-group biases, this of course leads us to think about stereotypes. And stereotypes are widely held beliefs that we have about certain characteristics because of their membership in a particular group. So if I were to ask you to take a moment and to describe the characteristics of a football player, of a class president, of a cheerleader, of a introvert, or any of these individuals, we could take any category. I imagine that many of you may have certain ideas about what each of these individuals are like, and some of those may be based on stereotypes. Some examples of stereotypes include ethnicity, race, gender, and religion, and can also be based on physical appearance. And this is one example is described in your book. It's called the "What is beautiful is good" stereotype. The Greek poet Sappho is credited with first asserting 2,600 years ago that what is beautiful is good. And in 1882, the German Romantic poet Friedrich Schiller wrote that physical beauty is the sign of an interior beauty, a spiritual and moral beauty. The "what is beautiful is good" stereotype manifests itself in a slew of real-life situations, and it's been documented in many, many research studies. And taken as a whole, the studies show that this is one of the more robust cognitive biases that operate in our minds. In a study that was done in 1972, people guessed that attractive strangers possessed a range of desirable personality traits. They ventured that they were probably sincere, honest, altruistic, exciting, genuine, warm, sociable, kind, and more. And the subjects also expected the attractive strangers' lives to be happier and more successful than those of less attractive strangers. Studies have also found that people are more willing to help attractive people and even give them more room on sidewalks. And attractive defendants are less likely to be convicted. And when they are, they get more lenient sentences. So you might be wondering, is there any truth to this? So there have been studies to examine whether or not people who are more attractive actually have these characteristics or qualities that are more favorable. In a study that examined how women who had been viewed as attractive were likely to fare a year after the study. They found that those women who were viewed as being attractive were no more likely to have desirable personality traits, even though the judges believed that they did. And there were other, and it seemed as though, other traits like being easygoing and conscientious, those weren't supported either. So, and there have been other studies such as this that really suggest that there's not any real connection between being attractive and having these positive traits. It's just that we make this assumption. Now, some of you might wonder, why do we make this assumption? It may be because we're biologically wired to have a preference for symmetrical faces. And this is a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but we are wired to be attracted to facial symmetry. And this is evident even in babies who tend to spend more time gazing at symmetrical faces. And so it's thought that maybe this is we're just, because we're wired to look at to want to spend more time looking at symmetrical faces, that we like symmetry, which is associated with facial attractiveness, that maybe it requires less cognitive resources to process attractive faces. And so maybe this then affects how then we further process information. And so, but there's, and it's interesting too that in one study they found that when they measured the electrical activity in the brains of adults and four-month-olds, they found higher activity when the participants looked at unattractive faces. And it's a rule of thumb in neuroscience that higher brain activity during a task is a marker for more effort being expended. So maybe more positive qualities are being associated with faces because less cognitive effort is being exerted. And that's one suggestion that researchers have, and there are some others as well. But I think what's probably most important here for us to think about is that we need to remember that we may be prone to these biases. We might not be able to stop our minds from making this illogical, beautiful equals good leap, but being aware of this perhaps deeply ingrained habit of thought can be the first step in reining it in. And this isn't just about fairness. It's also about not being taken by or influenced by someone who's selling a product who's attractive, that we might not really, we really don't need that product. So if we're aware of these biases, then they can positively impact how we treat others and our vulnerability to the choices that we make. So knowing about our cognitive biases gives us that chance to override them. Let's take another look at a concept that is related to forming the impressions of others, and that's the concept of the fundamental attribution error. And this basically suggests that when we see someone doing something, we tend to think it relates to their personality rather than the situation that the person might be in. So for example, if someone cuts in front of you in line, your immediate reaction might be, oh my gosh, this person is so rude. But in reality, perhaps this person never cuts in lines and is doing it just this time because maybe they're about to, maybe they're going to be late for work, or they're going to miss a plane, or they're trying to get to the hospital on time before a baby is born. What's really interesting about the fundamental attribution error is that we tend to make it about other people, but rarely about ourselves. When we do things, we always have a good reason. It's the other people we see as, I guess we could say, being defective. So a classic example of this might be a person who doesn't call you back. So you call a friend and they don't call you back, and you might say to yourself, oh, this person's really inconsiderate, and I don't know that I really want to be, hang out with them. They're pretty rude. Perhaps that might be your response, especially if they do this a few times. But if you're aware of the fundamental attribution error, you would be reminded that there may be other reasons why this person hasn't called you back, and that we have this tendency to focus on personal features rather than situational ones. So maybe your friend's going through major issues in their life. Maybe they're traveling for work. Maybe they just forgot. So it's really important that, again, we remember that we have this tendency to look for personal attributions rather than situational factors. And if we are aware of this, then we'll look more at the situational factors that might explain their behavior. So making attributions requires two steps. Occurring spontaneously, observers make an internal attribution, like I just described, and it's only with cognitive effort and attention that we weigh the impact of the situation and then we adjust our inference. So the second step is more effortful and we often skip it. So we need to make that effort if we want to have a more accurate impression of what's actually going on. If you look in your textbook, you'll see a diagram illustrating this. Here we have in step 1 that automatic, mindless approach to thinking, where we make an initial observation about an actor's behavior. And our initial automatic, mindless attribution is one that is personal. So we have a customer that argues loudly with a bank teller, and we conclude they're a hostile person. But the second step is one that is more effortful and mindful, where the observer becomes aware of situational influences on the actor's behavior. So the observer hears the customer say that the bank has often made the same error. So here we now have the observer modifying their initial attribution based on the situational information. So he's probably not such a hostile person after all. Now, of course, you might have further processing taking place here. As you look at this diagram, some of you might think to yourself, well, even if the bank does tend to make this error, why would he become hostile? Perhaps that isn't a rational response. So you might have further processing as you're looking at this. But here we can still see the most basic, sort of example where we go from this automatic mindless processing to one that is more effortful and mindful. And when we do that and we make it a habit, then we're less inclined to regularly engage in that fundamental attribution error and therefore have more accurate, an accurate understanding of what's actually taking place. So we do have a tendency to make many different errors in attribution. And one type of error that we make is what's called a defensive attribution. And this is the tendency to blame victims for their misfortunes so that we feel less likely to be victimized in a similar way. There are many examples of times when people might make this type of error. So typically we think about the defensive attribution error coming up when bad events happen. And this might be especially true when we witness or are close to negative events. So let's take the example of a car accident. Imagine you see a car accident on the highway. It's likely that you'll start to think about what caused the accident. You might even find yourself making a defensive attribution. Maybe you look at the car and you think that the driver must have been texting or drunk, or even that they're just a bad driver. What you're doing is you're attributing the accident to some internal factor of the person in the accident. If you don't make this kind of attribution, you're faced with the possibility that sometimes accidents happen by chance. Then you would have to think about how it's possible that you could get into a car accident at any time. So in order to avoid this anxiety, you attribute the accident to the driver of the car. Another example of a defensive attribution could be of natural disasters. So, we search for cause, as many of you know, when we are trying to understand some of these seemingly random world events. And you might think about the Northern California wildfires that we are hearing about, and those that are happening in Oregon as well. And these are a great example of how people try to search for a cause of random events. And many news outlets have written articles that lay out the possible causes of these fires. And, the reason it is so popular to write articles like this and that you see so many of them is that people feel better when they have a concrete cause for world events. So it's much easier to accept that the fires were caused by faulty power lines, for example, than it is to think that sometimes wildfires just happen. There are some important key themes that you're seeing in your text, in-person perception. One is efficiency. When we form the impressions of others, we tend to default to automatic processing. Being aware of this can help us to engage in a more controlled processing. And then we also see selectivity. We see what we expect to see. And this goes back to that concept of confirmation bias, where we focus on aspects of the person that confirm our expectations. And then we have consistency. First impressions do matter. When a perceiver has formed an impression of someone, they tend to tune out subsequent information. And again, this goes back to confirmation bias, and this is called the primacy effect. Prejudice refers to irrational or unjustifiable negative emotions or evaluations towards people from other social groups. and it's a primary determinant of discriminatory behavior. Discrimination refers to inappropriate treatment of people because of their actual or perceived group membership, and it may include both overt and covert behaviors, including microaggressions or indirect or subtle behaviors like comments that reflect negative attitudes or beliefs about a non-majority group. So, while your book doesn't describe specifically the concept of racism, I think it's important to note how it relates to prejudice and discrimination. So racism refers to prejudice or discrimination against individuals or groups that are based on beliefs about one's own racial superiority, or the belief that race reflects inherent differences in attributes and capabilities. Racism is the basis for social stratification and differential treatment that advantage a dominant group, and it can take many forms that include explicit racial prejudice and discrimination by individuals and institutions, like what you've learned about with the Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction, as well as structural or environmental racism in policies or practices that foster discrimination and mutually reinforcing social inequalities, like attendance policies that might favor a majority group. It can also take the form of unconscious beliefs and stereotypes and attitudes towards racial groups in the form of implicit biases, so assuming limited ability when students speak non-standard English, or fearful responses to verbal or physical behavior of non-white students. So other forms of racism are modern symbolic racism, in which individuals deny the continued existence of racial inequality while contributing to discrimination, and aversive racism and in-group favoritism for the dominant racial group. I bring these three terms up because when we think about prejudice and discrimination, we typically do think of racism. Of course, discrimination and prejudice is not only something related to ethnicity or skin color. We know that there are a variety of groups that experience prejudice and discrimination. This, of course, can be based on gender, based on age, based on ability, just to name a few. When we think about the causes of discrimination and prejudice and racism, there are a variety of causes that are described in your textbook. And if you look in your textbook, you can also see how prejudice and discrimination are laid out in a figure that will help you to think about the relationship between the two and the differences between the two. The authors of your textbook describe two different types of discrimination. They describe old-fashioned discrimination, which is overt, and while this still exists, it has declined in recent years. And a more subtle form of discrimination has emerged, and that's modern discrimination. This happens when people privately harbor negative attitudes towards minority groups, but express them only when they feel that these views are justified or when it's safe to do so. Related to discrimination is a concept that some of you have likely heard of as you've watched the news or in some of your other classes, and that's the concept that is known as implicit bias. This is a tendency for stereotype confirming thoughts to pass spontaneously through our minds, and it sets people up to overgeneralize, sometimes leading to discrimination, even when people think they're being fair. One of the most famous measurements of implicit bias is one that has been done at Harvard University. And you can actually do a search for the implicit bias test, or you could do a search, I think the best term would be implicit association test at Harvard. And you can actually participate in this. And there are a variety of types of implicit biases that they measure. And most people who take this test show evidence of implicit bias. And this suggests that most people are implicitly biased, even if they don't think of themselves as prejudiced. This test, like any measure, though, of course, has limitations, and the stability is relatively low, meaning that if you take the same test a few weeks apart, you might score differently. and the correlation between the implicit association scores and discriminatory behavior is often rather small. However, that doesn't mean that we are not affected by implicit biases. And while this implicit bias test may not make a prediction about your individual behavior, it seems that it may be able to make a prediction about the behavior of groups of people. So it may be useful for predicting how groups will respond on average and not for how particular individuals will behave. So I think this is interesting because the implicit association test has predicted average outcomes across larger entities. So not individuals, but like counties, cities, or states. So, for example, metro areas with greater average implicit biases have larger racial disparities in police shootings. And counties with greater average implicit bias have larger racial disparities in infant health problems. So these correlations are important. Of course, we could not do an experiment to study cause and effect here. We're talking about the relationship between the variable of implicit bias and group and how that then pans out to affect the average behavior across a group. What it tells us is that implicit bias matters and that it does seem to have an effect on behavior. So just to kind of give you an example of some real world discrimination that does exist, and you could think about how this may be related to implicit bias or to modern discrimination. White applicants get about 50% more callbacks than Black applicants with the same resumes. And physicians recommend less pain medication for Black patients than white patients with the same injury. So, those are just a couple of examples. I'm sure you've come across many examples in maybe papers that you've written for other classes, or what you've read, or of course from maybe your own personal experience. Let's now take a moment to think about the causes of prejudice. And your book outlines some very specific reasons that are well supported by research. Let's first take a look at authoritarianism. So early research that was done in 1950 by Adorno and some of his colleagues suggested that prejudice is the result of an individual's personality type. And they used a questionnaire that they called the F scale, and the F scale was F for fascism. So Adorno argued that deep-seated personality traits predispose some people to be highly sensitive to totalitarian and anti-democratic ideas, and therefore were prone to be very prejudiced. And the evidence that he and his research colleagues provided was he used some case studies and psychometric testing and clinical interviews. And he found that people who had an authoritarian personality tended to be hostile to people who were of inferior status, but obedient to people with high status. And they tended to be fairly rigid in their opinions and their beliefs, and tended to be pretty conventional in their values. And so he suggested that people with authoritarian personalities were more likely to categorize people into us and them groups, and seeing their own group as superior. Some of the criticisms of this approach to thinking about prejudice is that some prejudiced people don't conform to the authoritarian personality type, and it doesn't really explain why people are prejudiced against certain groups and not others. Another explanation for prejudice is that people tend to engage in cognitive distortions and expectations where this social categorization predisposes people to divide the social world into in-groups and out-groups. This is an advertisement that was put out by the American Civil Liberties Union, and they ask, which man looks guilty? And if you pick the man on the right, you're wrong for judging people based on the color of their skin, because if you look closely, you'll see that they're the same man. And the advertisement goes on to say, unfortunately, racial stereotyping like this happens every day. And on American highways, police stop drivers based on their skin color rather than for what they're driving. For example, in Florida, 80% of those stopped and searched were Black and Hispanic, while they constituted only 5% of all drivers. These humiliating and illegal searches are violations of the Constitution and must be fought. Help us defend your rights. Support the ACLU. So this ad and a multitude of others of ads and movements really have been an effort to help people to become aware of the biases that they have and how then this affects behavior and how this results in very, in the wrongful treatment of people based on superficial characteristics like skin color. I think also going back to cognitive distortions, we need to think too about the self-fulfilling prophecy, and we need to think about confirmation bias. So what I would encourage you to think about is reflect on what is self-fulfilling prophecy. We talked about this earlier. And how could you relate this to the concept of prejudice? How might that cause prejudice? And then let's think about confirmation bias. How can confirmation bias contribute to prejudice? So I'd encourage you to think about those and also to read the section in your textbook about that. Another source of prejudice is competition between groups. And this is the perceived threats to one's group, such as conflict over scarce resources. And this can cause prejudice against outgroup members. Now, these scarcity of resources may or may not be real. Historically, when there have been limited resources, it has bred hostility between groups. As a matter of economics, one group might fare better in the struggle for land or jobs or power than another group historically. And the losing group might become frustrated or resentful, and the winning group might feel threatened and protective. And before long, there might be, historically a big conflict that would heat up and boil. And, it's likely that a lot of prejudice in the world can be, explained by competition, whether it's real or perceived competition or scarcity of resources. For example, in the Netherlands, they found that as unemployment levels went up, that discrimination against ethnic minority groups tended to increase. And you can think about in many instances, as you hear about minority groups on the news in this country, you'll find that some people will tie their unfounded, their very unfounded beliefs about minority groups and their discriminatory beliefs in this idea that there's a scarcity of resources. And what's interesting is that sometimes there is a real scarcity of resources, but sometimes there's not. And sometimes what happens is you might find that certain politicians or people who are trying to gain some leverage or power may create a belief that there is a scarcity of resources when there's not, in order to pit one group against another. Another explanation for prejudice is the threat to, or potential threat to, social identity. So people all over the world believe that their own nation, culture, and language and religion may be ideal, or it may be better than or more deserving than others. Of course, there are exceptions. There are many people who may not believe this, but there are many people who do. And part of this reason is that, it's even more basic than the real or perceived competition for resources. Rather, it stems from something more subtle and psychological. So there was a study that was done of high school boys in England. And this was a study conducted in 1971. The boys in this study were shown a series of dotted slides, and their task was to estimate the number of dots on each slide. The slides were presented in a rapid-fire succession, so the dots couldn't be counted. Later, the experimenter told the participants that some people are chronic overestimators and others are underestimators. So as part of a second, entirely separate task, participants were divided into two groups, one that was said to consist of overestimators and the other of underestimators. And in fact, they were actually divided randomly. So participants in this study were then told to allocate points to other participants that could be cashed in for money. So this procedure was designed to create minimal groups in which people are categorized on the basis of these trivial or minimally important similarities. The overestimators and underestimators, they weren't long-term rivals, and they didn't have a history of antagonism. They weren't frustrated. They didn't compete for a limited resource, and they were not even acquainted well with each other. But participants consistently allocated more points to members of their own group than members of the other group. And this pattern of discrimination, which we could call in-group favoritism, has been found repeatedly in studies in many countries and using a variety of different measures. And so this in-group favoritism can be explained by actually something that's called social identity theory. And it suggests that we all, each of us tries to enhance our self-esteem, and this happens through, we want to, through our personal identity and our collective or social identity that we belong to. So, in other words, we can boost our self-esteem through our own personal achievements or through our affiliation with successful groups. And what's nice about the need for social identity is it leads us to derive pride from our connections with others. And even if we didn't receive any direct benefits from these others, but what's sad is that we may feel the need to belittle them, the other group, in order to feel secure about us. And this, of course, can, you can think about all of the different groups that, all of the different ways, that this might emerge, whether it be through a belief that one's race is better, ethnicity is better, nationality is better, religion is better. And what's also interesting and disturbing too is that when researchers in a study that was done in 2006, they found that when people shared negative attitudes about a third party, they felt closer to each other. There are, of course, many problems with prejudice. One is called stereotype threat, and this is where the individuals who are the targets of a stereotype are affected by the stereotype in terms of their performance. And so the stereotype that they experience undermines their performance on standardized tests and other measures of academic achievement. So to give you an example, and I like to give you these research examples so you can see how studies are done in psychology, and then also to help you to think more deeply about the concept. There was a study that was conducted by two researchers by the name, or three of them actually, Spencer, Steele, and Quinn. And they found that just telling women that a math test does not show gender differences improve their test performance. And that's interesting because that shows us, while that's not aligned with the stereotype threat, it really shows how, receiving positive information can affect performance. So on the other side of the coin, let's think about the stereotype threat, where researchers gave a math test to women and men after telling half the women that the test had shown gender differences and telling the rest that it found none. And when test administrators told the women that the test showed no gender differences, the women performed equal to men. Those who were told the test showed gender differences did significantly worse than men, just like women who were told nothing about the test. And so it was actually a study that was conducted with women who were top performers in math, just as, so it's not as though it was a test on women who were who were weaker in math. These were women who would normally have done well, and their performance was affected by the information they received about their gender. So what are some ways to reduce prejudice? One involves cognitive strategies, where we need to make an effort to override stereotypes by using controlled processing instead of relying on snap judgments and automatic processing. We also need to remember that we have that tendency to look for evidence that supports our beliefs. So if one has a belief about a particular outgroup, then that's what they're going to find. So we need to be aware of that so that we then are open to other possibilities. We also need to remember the effects of the self-fulfilling prophecy. What we expect is often what we get. Also, having increased contact with people who are in our outgroup is important. And so by creating goals that require 2 or more groups to work together to achieve mutual ends, this can reduce intergroup hostility. So actually having a structured situation where this happens can be extremely helpful.
Let's now see if you remember some of the things you've learned. Which of the following elements is not a key source of information in person perception? Is it physical appearance, physical actions, nonverbal communication, or material possessions? If you selected material possessions, you're right. If you weren't sure, be sure to take a look at your notes. Make sure you go back and take a look at your book, and you can also go back and watch this video. Here's another one. Isabella believes that she failed her stats midterm because she's right-brained, and she says that her brain is just not wired for math. Which type of attribution for her performance is she demonstrating? Is it internal, external, rational, or fundamental? If you chose internal, you're right. Remember, internal attributions are those things that are coming from within a person. They are an individual's personal traits and characteristics. External attributions are those that are outside of the individual. Those could include circumstances, things going on in the environment, or anything that's outside of that person's individual characteristics. Here's another one. A negative attitude held toward a particular social group is defined as perceptionism, prejudice, discrimination, or defensive attribution. If you chose prejudice, you're right. So prejudice is an unjustified or an incorrect attitude, and it's usually negative towards an individual that's based solely on the individual's membership of a social group, whereas discrimination is the behavior or the actions that are usually negative towards an individual or group of people, especially on the basis of sex, race, social class, or other similar variables. Here's another one. Research supports the notion that shifting from blank to blank can reduce stereotyping and prejudice. Is it switching from automatic processing to controlled processing, old-fashioned discrimination to symbolic racism, cooperative interdependence to intergroup competition, or defensive attribution to diffusion of responsibility? If you selected automatic processing to controlled processing, you're right. Remember that some of the stereotypes that one may hold about a particular member of a group who is not part of their in-group happen through automatic processing without even conscious awareness. It is so important that we become aware of those thoughts, that we stop ourselves and question our thinking so that we can engage in more controlled processing. It's so critical for us as a society to reduce stereotyping and prejudice. There are multiple negative effects on both mental health and even physical health. So understanding the nature of prejudice and stereotyping is of significant importance within the field of psychology. Here's another one. Suppose you run into a psychology classmate, Rebecca, at the coffee shop, and you strike up small talk while you're in line. You find out that she's interested in cognitive psychology and neuroscience and is perversely excited about learning a new statistical software package. You also find out that Rebecca likes pumpkin spice lattes. The next time that you run into Rebecca on campus, you utter a silly remark about spicy pumpkins, but fail to remember her interests in areas like psychology and or her geeking out on statistics. This is most likely an example of an external attribution, confirmation bias, self-serving bias, or fundamental bias. If you selected confirmation bias, you're right. Remember, with confirmation bias, we end up seeking out what we want to see. We focus on information that may be personally relevant or meaningful to us. And when we do this, we end up not paying attention to other information. So think now about your conversation with this person, Rebecca, and how now that you see her again on campus, you bring up spicy pumpkins. How is that conversation going to transpire? In what direction is it going to go versus if you had remembered her interest in areas like psychology or in statistics? Whatever we tend to talk about affects then what other people talk about. And then this has an effect on our impressions that we have of those people. So let's take this to a broader or deeper level. Let's imagine that you hold certain stereotypes about people who are from a particular group. Let's imagine that Rebecca is a cheerleader and you have particular stereotypes about cheerleaders. And so when you meet Rebecca or when you talk with her, you ask her certain questions or you bring up certain topics that are potentially related to the stereotypes that you hold. Then what happens? Rebecca then is likely going to confirm your stereotypes. She's going to show interest in the areas that you brought up. And if you didn't think that Rebecca was, let's say, that smart, which is a very unfair stereotype that some people hold about cheerleaders, you may find that because of the types of questions that you ask, Rebecca may not come across as very smart. Maybe you ask questions that are very surface level or that are unrelated to anything that would require much learning. And so then your conclusions about Rebecca, they continue. They are supported. The ones that you have already, I should say, are supported, and your beliefs continue. And so we can imagine then or see how confirmation bias can perpetuate stereotypes. So what have you learned so far? Well, you learned the 5 sources of information that people use to form impressions of others. You also learned about the key differences between snap judgments and systematic judgments, and how these different processes affect the perceptions that we have of others. You also learned about the characteristics of attributions and 2 attribution-based expectations that can distort observers' perceptions. You learned also about 4 important cognitive distortions and how these happen. And then finally, you learned about some of the ways that perceptions of others are efficient, selective, and consistent. What will you be learning about next in our next video? You're going to learn about how various social factors influence the persuasion process. You'll also learn about the one-sided versus two-sided messages and the value of arousing fear or positive feelings in persuasion. You'll also learn about the receiver factors that have an impact or play a role in persuasion. And you'll learn about 2 different cognitive routes to persuasion. As always, please let me know if you have any questions.